This latest mid-season patch has massively changed the entire game again. Tanks have gotten way harder to deal with, so the hero rankings have really switched up. So let's get into the DPS tier list for mid-season 11, starting off with the classic, Reaper in D tier. It's no wonder that he's still bad now that tanks have gotten even stronger. Ramattra can tank more shots in his Nemesis form, D.Va can matrix you for longer, even Reinhardt now one-shots you with Pin. At the very least, the Reaper buffs at the start of season 11 have definitely helped with the whole not being able to kill tanks thing. He can actually be pretty successful just teleporting in and trading abilities. If you do it right, you can do it often and systematically force out cooldowns until you or your other DPS can kill everyone. But full transparency, Reaper is still really bad. Just D.Va alone is enough to shut him down, and she just got a lot more popular, so it's definitely not looking good. Moving up to C tier, first is Bastion. He's been heavily affected by the armor buff. He can pretty much only spam the front line, so now that he deals 40% reduced damage against armor in his recon form, his pre-fight pressure is way too weak. You can still play around Bastion because he does have some armor of his own. Pocketing him and pressuring the enemy team with turret form is still very strong, but even so, every tank with armor has a massive advantage. When you have to get value out of your form against 300 plus armor, it's just way too much of a challenge. If you're looking to rank up on your favorite heroes, check out the link in the description below to get access to a GameLeap membership. There are tons of guides and courses that can level up your game and help you get better, faster. Make sure to check it out and enjoy the video. Next up, Soldier 76 has really fallen from his consistent A tier spot. The new armor has completely shut him out of the meta. Out of all the ranged spam heroes, he's now the weakest by far. Even before the armor change, he just hasn't been offering much besides pick potential and spam. And now that his spam is much less useful, it's pretty clear that there are also way better heroes that can deal way more burst damage while also breaking armor. He just doesn't bring enough to the table. Visor stinks, and his heal station is so easy to force out. There are a few maps where the flanks are great for beaming backline, but if that's your game plan, every flanker does it way better anyway. He's pretty much the most affected by the armor changes. You can use your rocket to break it if you're playing to tough it out and keep running the legs, but it's gonna be painful for sure. Moving on to Torbjorn. With Pharah still sticking around, he's way less effective, but his frontline spam and lane control is decent. Pressuring two places at once is really good, but it depends on good turret positioning, and on the enemy team to not notice that positioning and then break the turret. It's just really easy to do for so many heroes. But otherwise, Torb is just a defensive hero. It's getting really spammy in the meta, but Torb just can't reliably win the range duel. It's also less reliable to focus the tank down with your damage, even if Torb's output is roughly the same, so you've got to be able to pressure the enemy squishies, and just having a turret watching the flank isn't enough. Moving up to B tier, Sojourn is just barely staying out of the gutters. She doesn't have her one-shot burst anymore, but she still has decent burst damage readily available. Damage into armor may be reduced, but it still charges railgun shots, so Sojourn can definitely do a lot of raw damage. And because the railgun shot is easy to hit cross-map, you can even tag supports for some extra valuable damage. It really can't be overstated how much weaker she is than before though, but her kit is good enough that she's not total garbage tier. You can still rotate fast, deal damage at range, and zone with your disruptor shot. The railgun shots and ultimate impact have just been toned down to the most normal level. Now for Widowmaker. She's not exactly more useful this patch, but she does primarily focus on getting headshot kills. The only thing that's changed from before is that all the dive tanks are stronger, and that basically means you have a bigger chance of getting one shot. But Widow is Widow. If you hit your shots, you'll win your fights. And there's a fair share of maps where you can dominate easily with good positioning. One step further into B tier is Venture. It's a good meta for cleaning up with Tectonic Shock, so the only challenge is keeping constant pressure and fishing for one-shots until you can wipe the enemy team. And it's not easy, but the massive amount of burst damage in their kit makes it worth it on close-range maps. Everywhere else, you can still make do by playing flanky for duels, since Venture is pretty impossible to punish unless you're in a 1v3 or worse. Or right next to Cassidy with his flashbang. Halfway through B tier, first we've got Sombra. She has a good matchup into D.Va and Sigma, so she's actually good at forcing their abilities. But that doesn't mean she's suddenly easy to play around. The new tank passive and the extra armor means building ultimate charge is always a slog. Even if you keep trying to farm squishies instead, it's really difficult unless the enemy team has no way to chase you. And at this point in Overwatch 2, everyone has some form of burst armor ability to help catch your translocator escape. Sombra's burst damage and hack are great, but there are a lot of counter swaps to deal with her in all sorts of ways. Surviving her engage, chasing her down, or wiping her team before she's set up. Next we've got Mei. She's actually decent most of the time, especially now that her Icicle does more damage. Out of all the frontline DPS that struggle to get around the enemy tank, she's the most consistent. Her wall breaks really easily, but still has enough impact to win fights with good placement. She's also one of the least affected by the armor changes, and with her spray that goes through Matrix, Mei has a pretty good matchup into the top tanks. She's mostly limited to frontline fights, which is not ideal this patch, but she's got enough spam and utility as long as you can find choke points to wall off. Although not every map is going to make that easy for you. And for the top of B tier, it's Junkrat. His damage output is just insane, and even Rip Tower can get a lot of value with the right setup. And even though he's a pretty linear hero who just gets value out of hitting grenades, it's really effective on a lot of maps. The fact that he can two-shot squishies now and that's normal is pretty crazy. So even though he's the same old junk who can't contest Pharah and can get fully matrixed, he's way more useful on a regular basis. Just breaking armor alone is worth playing him, and he can do so much more than just be AFK main spamming tank. On to A tier, we're starting with Hanzo. He's also excellent into armor and just has good regular ranged burst damage. Not having a one-shot anymore is obviously a big complaint for experienced Hanzo mains, but hitting arrows on squishies is already really effective. If you're looking for picks, storm arrows have only gotten better over time. Now that we're at A tier, there are way less hard counters, and Hanzo is only really vulnerable to being dived. Still, he's got high damage to protect himself, mobility to kite back, and sonic arrow to scout enemies before they get on top of you. Hanzo is a super reliable pick, even if he's not the best pick from the spam heroes. He can still contest with them. Next up is Tracer. She's a little lower in A tier than usual this patch, but it's mostly because other heroes are better suited after the tank buffs. Even so, her playstyle works perfectly fine. Tanks are just harder to pressure, and there are still a lot of heroes that can mark Tracer, but unless she gets some major nerfs, she's gonna stay strong with good movement and good aim. It won't be easy, but Tracer has everything she needs to carry, even in the heavy spam brawl meta, and killing tanks with pulse bombs still works even if they're super durable the rest of the time. One spot higher than Tracer is Genji. The armor changes have made him weaker this patch, but he's also one of the best heroes for pushing hard into spam teams. Super high burst damage is tough to deal with, but it can also get sent right back to the enemy team with Deflect. Just like it is for Tracer, there are a lot of ways to mark Genji, but he does have an easier time. He doesn't need to constantly set up on the flank, getting in dash range is usually enough. The rest of the heroes on the list are much safer picks, but if you want to avoid spamming an unkillable tank for the whole game, you'll want a hero like Genji to hit the backline to either force their abilities or kill them outright. Halfway through A tier, next is Symmetra. It's pretty funny that she's now one of the most well-rounded DPS. Her secondary fire projectiles are discount Pharah rockets, and her close range beam charges fast and shreds tanks even faster. And she even has points in durability and movement, and the current state of her teleporter is super impactful. She doesn't have the worst matchup into flyers, but it is definitely a weakness. She's clearly not S tier. Without her teleporter, it gets a lot easier to shut her down and out of the fight. But for a hero with limited range, she's amazing and much better than before. Number 2 in A tier goes to Echo. The armor change is so crazy that now Echo does 50% damage into armor. It's way harder for her to focus tanks, which is a big part of her neutral, but not so big that she's C tier like Soldier. Outside of the tank matchup, she's as good as ever, and even though tanks are tankier, focusing beam still does its job. You're not completely blocked from pressuring tanks, and either way, shooting shields or using stickies is enough to force abilities. Echo can still do way too much, so she's staying in the top 4. As for the number 3 spot, the best in A tier, it's Cassidy. This mid-season, he got his fall-off range reduced by 5 meters, and that's a pretty big hit when his range was already short enough that you had to play around it. His kit is still great though. His flashbang has been really effective, and his role remains a great way to play aggro with low risk. He's actually a lot more balanced now that his range is more defined. He can still 2-tap and deal heavy burst even with the reduced max range, but it does take him out of S tier for sure. So taking his spot as the number 1 hit scan is our first hero in S tier, Ashe. She was already a good alternative, and now Cass has even less range, and Bob is even stronger. The tank passive headshot reduction is massive for keeping Bob up. It's actually reduced the amount of heroes that can deal with him quickly, and for a while it's going to be really tough to decide whether it's worth killing him or not. Outside of the ultimate, Ashe has great range and damage that's only slightly affected by armor. It's reduced by 25% at the most with her hipfire, which is still fine for forcing out tanks. Even though she's much squishier than Cass is, she's got Coach Gun to work with and Dynamite to really apply the pressure. She can get insane value when uncontested, so that's her only real problem, getting contested. And it's why Pharah still takes the number 1 spot. There's not much the enemy team can do to avoid your spam when you're flying high up. Even the hyper buff diva will take time to set up on you, at which point you can use up to 3 movement abilities to get away from her. Despite that, Pharah can be pretty killable when she gets too close, but Cassidy's reduced range means that Pharah will be the top dog for a little while longer. There just aren't enough heroes to contest her to stop her insanely consistent spam damage. Her burst damage breaks armor instantly, forces out flankers instantly, and her reverted concussive blast gives her even more zone control. It's a tanky season, and Pharah remains on top. That's it for the DPS tier list for Season 11. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.